Fertility procedures are used all over the world today. Maybe you have heard of test tube babies. The first test tube baby was Cameron, who was born to Louise Brown back in 1978. The procedure that she had done is known as IVF, or in vitro fertilization. It was first performed in England, and what they did was they removed an oocyte from Louise's ovary, then they fertilized it outside her body and implanted the embryo back inside her uterus. 40 years later, more than 8 million babies around the world have been born using these procedures. But I want us to stop and think about this. What are moral options for heterosexual married couples who are experiencing infertility? And spiritually, what are some things that we should think about when families face these type of hardships? I invite you to think with me about infertility for just a moment. Infertility can involve things involving both the male and the female in certain instances. It involves the use of assisted reproduction technology, in vitro fertilization, and intrauterine insemination. Let's begin by thinking about women who suffer from barrenness. The Bible says in Proverbs chapter 30 and verse 15, 3 things are never satisfied, 4 never say enough. Sheol, the barren womb, the land never satisfied with water, and the fire that never says enough. Couples may be unable to conceive for several reasons that could be attributed to male, female, or both factors. It's possible for a person to attach their value and self-worth to their ability to have children. This can impact one's self-esteem, and it can provide instances of shame or embarrassment, particularly when people continue to ask questions like, when are you having children? Faithful couples who are barren bear a certain burden, and they certainly deserve compassion and empathy and care. In the Old Testament, being fruitful and having children was a blessing from God. Exodus chapter 1 and verse 7, Exodus chapter 23 and verse 26. In contrast, barrenness at times was a punishment from God. Genesis chapter 20 verses 17 and 18. It should be pointed out that in the Bible, many have experienced barrenness through no moral fault or sin of their own. It wasn't their doing. The sore painfulness of barrenness was expressed by Sarah in Genesis 16:5, Rachel in Genesis 30 verse 1, Hannah in 1 Samuel 1 verses 6 and 7, and Elizabeth in the New Testament in Luke chapter 1 and verse 25. Ethically, we also want to give thought to the dignity and sanctity of human life from the point of fertilization. This is really important when we start talking about infertility procedures. Concerning dignity, embryos should not be created to be destroyed. All adults and all children were once embryos, and humans are created in the image of God, Genesis chapter 1 and verse 27. If you look at the usage of the Greek word brephos in the New Testament, you would notice this, that the same word that is used for a baby inside the womb is used for an infant outside the womb. I would encourage you, look at Luke chapter 1 and verse 41 and 44, and then also look at Acts chapter 7 and verse 19. In fact, I would encourage you to check out our video on the value of human life, where we make a strong case that life has value from the point of fertilization. But let me ask you this question. What are some moral options for couples suffering from barrenness? Now, we've established that we uphold the value of human life, all human life, no matter how small. And if you're contemplating certain fertility treatments, I would encourage you to ask these questions. If we exercise the following fertility options, how many embryos are going to be created? I would ask your fertility specialist that question. And then I would ask this, once these embryos are created, what is going to be done with them? Will they be frozen? Will they be cryopreserved? And if so, once they are frozen, what procedures will be done with them? What is the cost associated with freezing these embryos? And once these embryos are created, how many will be transferred at a time? Are you comfortable with multiple pregnancies at once if the physician were to do multiple implantations? Would you be comfortable with taking twins to term, triplets to term, quadruplets to term? That's an important question because sometimes providers will talk about the risks of twins, triplets, or quadruplets. It's possible for a provider to come to you and tell you that they recommend what are known as singleton gestations and singleton deliveries. What does that mean? Well, that means if multiple implantations occur, that is, if 3 embryos were implanted, that as these babies continue to develop inside the womb, that the doctor might recommend to you selectively terminating the life of one or two or perhaps more even of those embryos. So I would ask questions like these. What is your plan for embryos that are not used in these treatments? Would you give these embryos up for adoption? What would you say if someone wanted to discard those embryos? And what would you say if someone wanted to use them in research? Morally, you will want to know how your provider views human life. Does your fertility specialist practice selective reduction? It is possible for some providers to treat embryos as new human life, full of dignity and sanctity. Or does the provider treat the embryo like sperm or egg, where they might discard an embryo? In other words, what does your fertility specialist believe about the status of human life? Again, I would encourage you to look at that video where we talk about the value of human life. I would encourage you that if your provider doesn't believe the same things that you do about human life based upon the teaching of the Bible, that you consider getting a different provider. I would ask you and your spouse this question. Will you as a couple value these early stages of embryonic development as valuable in God's eyes? If someone asked you to donate them for stem cell research, would you refuse? These are important moral questions that you should consider as you entertain these various procedures. Again, we're upholding the value of embryonic life from this very early stage. Again, look at that video and check it out. Number 3, I would encourage you as we examine different fertility procedures to think about the science of each of those procedures and some of the details that are involved in them. We could divide some of these procedures between primarily female procedures and then male procedures. When we talk about female procedures, we're talking about assisted reproductive technology, ART. When you think about ART, you think about eggs or ova and embryos. ART also would include genetic testing prior to implantation, something known as pre-implantation genetic testing, or PGT. The National Institute of Health notes that procedures where only sperm are manipulated, such as intrauterine inseminations, are not considered under this definition of ART. So primarily when we think about ART, we're primarily thinking about female procedures, although embryos are created, and when embryos are created, that would of necessity require sperm to come into the equation. ART includes this procedure that we have noted known as in vitro fertilization. When you see that abbreviation IVFET, it stands for in vitro fertilization with embryo transfer. In vitro refers to a procedure done outside the human body. We think about procedures that are done in a petri dish or in a test tube in science. In vivo procedures are procedures that are done inside a living organism. So in vitro fertilization would involve procedures done outside the female body. IVF occurs when a woman takes a drug, and then when she takes this drug, it's going to stimulate ovulation of multiple eggs. And then multiple eggs are going to be removed, they're going to be mixed with sperm in a lab dish, and then they'll be eventually transferred into a woman's uterus. An IVF cycle takes about 2 to 3 weeks. When we think about the numbers in society, 2.5 million IVF cycles are being done every year, resulting in about 500,000 deliveries annually. Several factors could contribute to why a couple might pursue IVF. According to the Mayo Clinic, there could be problems with the fallopian tubes. There could be a previous tubal ligation where the test tubes, where the tubes have been tied. There could be issues of ovulation. There could be issues with sperm. There could be a condition known as endometriosis where the endometrium is thickened and it comes outside the walls of the uterus. There's something known as uterine fibroids, which are tumors that occur. There can be moral concern with IVF in the creation of multiple embryos, knowing that some of those would be discarded. In a moment, we'll talk about ESET for just a moment. It's a great moral alternative to killing embryos or selectively reducing those. But let me review with you a few of the technicalities about some of the science that's involved in these procedures. Think with me about GIFT, G-I-F-T. That stands for gamete intrafallopian transfer. Well, what is that? Gamete intrafallopian transfer is when gametes, which consist of sperm and eggs, are taken from the ovary, mixed with the man's sperm, inserted into a catheter, and placed all the way up in the fallopian tubes in hopes that the fertilization will occur and then implantation subsequently. Another procedure is known as TET, T-E-T, tubal embryo transfer. What is this? This is when a 2-day-old embryo is surgically placed and transferred to the fallopian tube. Another procedure is known as ZIFT. ZIFT stands for zygote intrafallopian transfer. This is when early embryos, that are also known as zygotes, are transferred to the fallopian tube so they may make their journey to the uterus for implantation. So we think about these things, and we think about the procedures that are going on, and we understand the life cycle of different things that are involved. But I would like to offer and suggest this to you if you're considering fertility treatment. Consider something known as ESET, E-S-E-T, elective single embryo transfer. Why would I make a strong case for that? The reason why I would make a strong case for that is we're not terminating the life of 2 or more other embryos, or upon successive implantations, terminating more of those. But with single embryo transfer, it's just one that's implanted. And so this is something that could be considered by a woman who is experiencing infertility. Remember ESET, elective single embryo transfer. Now, when it comes to males, there are certain things that come up in a male's life that could lead to infertility as well. Think about the procedure known as artificial insemination by husband. This is when sperm would be provided by the husband. There is also another way to obtain sperm. It's also called artificial insemination by donor. This involves sperm donation and sperm banks and things of that nature. This is a really important topic when you start talking about surrogacy. The most common form of artificial insemination is known as intrauterine insemination, IUI, when a donor places sperm directly into the uterus. Other forms of artificial insemination place the sperm at the woman's cervix or at the fallopian tubes. Typically, when a husband and wife have intercourse, a few hundred sperm will reach the egg, sometimes within just a few minutes. However, with IUI, millions of healthy sperm can be placed near the egg. Another procedure, known as intracytoplasmic sperm injection, is a procedure that injects a single sperm directly into the cytoplasm. The cytoplasm, if you remember from biology class, is this gel-like substance inside the cell. So a single sperm is placed inside the egg as part of IVF. This is called ICSI. The first instance of it occurred in 1988, and subsequent procedures have been done over the years. It's not for every instance of IVF, but it's used in male factor infertility where there is low sperm production, a blockage of sperm delivery, or low production. So that's some technicalities when we start thinking about some of these infertility procedures. But what are some biblical factors that should be considered if you and your spouse are heterosexual and married? And what are some things that you should think about if you're contemplating ART or IVF or some other form of infertility treatment? First, it's certainly an occasion for prayer. Prayerfully consider the spiritual path of the child. If you're thinking about being a father, are you willing to invest the time to bring that child up in the discipline and the nurture and the instruction of the Lord? Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 4. Are you willing to love your wife, fathers, as Christ loves the church? Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 25. Fathers, are you willing to take the Great Commission seriously and take it into your home, realizing that your home is your first mission work, if you will? You see, as a spiritual leader in your home, your child will be counting on you. And your wife will be counting on you to be the spiritual head in your household. And so if you're wrestling with infertility, it's important as you contemplate these procedures to think about, am I honoring God with this work? And if a baby comes along and we're blessed by a beautiful child created in the image of God, will I raise them and put them on a trajectory and a path towards heaven? Mothers, there's some important spiritual questions that you could ask. Are you willing to use the strength that God has given you to nurture your child and to be a follower and a disciple of Christ? To realize that your home, too, is a mission field. To be like Timothy's mother or Timothy's grandmother that taught Timothy the Scriptures. Listen to these Proverbs. Proverbs chapter 14 and verse 1. The wisest of women builds her house, but folly with her own hands tear it down. You see, women, ladies, you're going to need wisdom, and that wisdom will come from above. Proverbs chapter 31 and verse 27 says about the worthy woman that she looks well to the ways of her household and does not eat the bread of idleness. Also, ladies, I would encourage you to think about this, that you must be committed to the value of human life from the point of fertilization. You know, all adults today have passed through various developmental phases, whether we're talking about a single-celled zygote, a multi-celled blastocyst, an embryo, a fetus, an infant, a toddler. We pass through all these successive stages in life, and we need to be committed to the value of human life from the point of fertilizations. Humans are not disposable. They should not be discarded. Biblically, at fertilization, a new human life begins, and this new human life is a neighbor. Mark chapter 12 and verse 31 says this, "You shall love your neighbor as yourself." So when we start thinking about infertility procedures, we ask this question, when were you and when will that baby of yours, perhaps, be a neighbor? Prior to the point of fertilization, a neighbor does not exist, but once fertilization occurs, a neighbor certainly does exist. What we believe about human life certainly matters. The issue of selective reduction is one that the Bible would object to. Killing an embryo is something that the Bible and God would object to. High order or multiple gestations are possible with multiple embryo implantations. So if you went this route, be sure you're willing to carry those babies to term. If you're not willing to carry those babies to term, then before those multiple implantations occur, elect ESET, elective single embryo transfer. This is a moral and a viable option for those who respect the dignity of the Word of God and His will. So in conclusion, I encourage you to dive into the video where we discuss the value of human life. It will certainly help add to your biblical knowledge. Jesus said in Luke chapter 14 and verse 28, "For which of you, desiring to build a tower, does not first sit down and count the cost, whether he has enough to complete it?" With all the advancements in medical technology and things of this era, we can do some things that ages and generations past have not been able to do. But I would be sure to let the Bible be your moral guide. Be sure to let God be guiding your thoughts and your intentions with your heart. Don't be terminating innocent human life in the process. Don't destroy human embryos in the name of advancement. Do things that are honorable. Faithful couples who are unable to conceive, they bear a burden, and that burden should not be dismissed. We should extend empathy and compassion to them. It can be embarrassing when people keep asking, when are you going to have kids? Or when are you going to have more kids? And things like that. Jesus came to this world to help those with physical and medical difficulties in their lives. And so may we use technology to set our kids on a path to heaven, that in all things, God may be glorified. Thank you.